I'd like to ask Martin O'Brien to come down. Martin's the Executive Officer of the Victorian Scientific Advisory Committee, a wildlife biologist with a special interest in native birds. And Martin's going to talk to us about, does the impact of the Indian Myna on native fauna meet the criteria for being listed as a threatening process? Interesting thought. Thank you, Martin.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to give you just a fairly succinct summary of the way one of the states in Australia, Victoria, has assessed the impact, or perceived or otherwise, of common miners from a legislative point of view. Just to give you an idea of the reasonably current distribution of the species in Victoria, and this is, as you've already heard from other speakers, it's expanding. And so my talk this morning is really how a nomination for the impact that common miners are having was assessed under the Victorian legislation, which is the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. So I'll briefly go through the objectives of the Victorian legislation, tell you a little bit about the Scientific Advisory Committee. I'm the Executive Officer of that committee. I support the committee, I don't actually make the decisions, and give you some idea of the actual listing process for threatening processes and threatened species and communities. Talk about the regulations associated with the Act, which support the listing of those items, and then give you a bit of detail of how the nomination of common miners as a threatening process, or potentially threatening process as it's called, was actually assessed by the committee. So this is a text taken from our Act. It's one of the oldest conservation acts in Australia. It basically tries to address all native organisms in terms of ensuring they survive for future generations. It also looks at conserving communities of flora and fauna, and in particular, as many people and jurisdictions across Australia are looking more into this, managing the threatening processes which threaten those species and communities. So the Scientific Advisory Committee is an independent committee established under the Act. Its members are appointed by the Minister for Environment, and the committee itself comprises 7 expert scientists, each with a prescribed area of expertise, which is also identified under the Act. So the committee's work is to advise the Minister on the listing of those species, communities, flora and fauna, or the threatening processes that are presented to the committee as nominations, and also advise our Minister on any other nature conservation matters. You've probably seen lots of these photos of our tropical animal. So the Act in Victoria, like the Acts in most other states, has a list of items, in particular the threatened list, which is the species and communities which are formally identified as threatened in our state, and the process list, which is the threatening processes. We also have an excluded list, which is things like human disease organisms, which you can't nominate under our legislation. So as I said, the threatened list contains species and communities of native flora and fauna which have been identified as threatened. And the process list is those threatening processes and the impact of noisy miners, impact of common miners, impact of samba. There's some examples of some of the things which have been assessed by the Scientific Advisory Committee in Victoria. So for those of you familiar with nomination and listing processes, the listing process commences with a member of the public or a community basically putting together an argument showing how they think a particular species or a threatening process meets the criteria for listing. And those criteria for listing are specified in the associated Flora and Fauna Guarantee regulations. And as I said, anyone can make a nomination. They don't have to be Victorian, it could be a group or an individual. So the nomination, which is just a simple, it can be a 2-page document or it can be a 50-page document. The more information that's provided by the nominator in terms of identifying what they perceive as a threatened species or its impact, the impact it's having on native species, the better, of course. So the Scientific Advisory Committee assesses the information presented and looks how that information basically stacks up against the listing criteria in the Flora and Fauna Guarantee regulations. So in Victoria, for a threatening process, in this case the impact Indian Myna or common Myna is having on our native flora and fauna, any threatening process to be accepted for a listing in our state would have to identify 2 or more native species that are being impacted by that particular process. And those species themselves don't have to be threatened. This is a common misconception, that it helps if they're threatened, of course, but they don't have to be threatened per se themselves. The process could also threaten a community of vegetation or a community of animals. And if the nominated can also show that, or the nominated can show how that process is affecting the development of these species or communities, that's also another line that they could use in their arguments for listing. So the title that was presented to the committee early last year was this one, so competition with native plants and animals, native fauna by the common Myna. So the committee looked at this over some meetings. It also spoke with a few relevant scientists and accessed BirdLife Australia databases and our state database, the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, and assessed that information and basically came down to the conclusion that currently the evidence did support the argument being presented in terms of that the nomination didn't show that within Victoria there weren't at least two species which were being impacted by common Mynas to the point that those species, native species, could become extinct as a result of the impact of Mynas in the long term. Now that first decision, if you like, is what we call a preliminary recommendation. That's then published for public input, and that enables the public to have their say on the basically the committee's thinking, whether they support or reject, and if they do support or reject, then provide some sort of evidence that for their arguments. And that occurred in May last year. The committee received a number of submissions from groups around Australia. The nomination itself was arguing that the competition, in particular for nest hollows by the common Myna, posed a threat to our native species. Now, this is a common phenomenon in terms of there's a perception here. You can see what's going on, but in fact, is the argument for that impact on our native fauna in particular, does it stand up in terms of it being a threat in the long term for the survival of these species in Victoria? It also particularly picked up on the impact Myna is having on reducing the availability of nest hollows for our native species, and as has already been picked up by Kate, whether that interrupted the breeding success of those same species. This is just an extract from the committee's recommendation report, which are public documents, and this is their wording of how they believe the current situation is. So this is just this past year or so in terms of the assessing of the information provided to the committee. They really thought that although there's lots of anecdotal information available on this, there wasn't the science, certainly from a Victorian point of view, which would support listing of common Mynas as a threatening process under our legislation. And they also alluded to the fact, to the commonly held view, of course, that there's a perception of a correlation between a reduction in populations of native species, which has been already identified by previous speakers for here in the ACT, but also in New South Wales. In Victoria, at least, that causative relationship, if you like, hasn't really been demonstrated. And if nothing else, I think that suggests to me that further research needs to be done. So after the close of that submission period, there's a statutory timeline of 30 days. The committee then made what's called its final recommendation, and that's also a public document available to anyone, and there's copies of that provided in your paperwork today. That advice is then provided to our minister. He then considers that advice when he makes his decision, and then he's agreed with that advice, and the outcome is that at this point in time, at least, the impact of common Mynas has been assessed by the independent committee, advised the minister, and the minister has accepted that advice. Now, one of the important things to realise in this is that should more information become available, and the whole process can easily start again. This is not the end point in things. So, for instance, from my knowledge, there's been about 5 nominations been made over the last 15 or 20 years, which have been renominated, and mostly those nominations have then got up a second time. So, if nothing else, if we can capture information in a way that enables these legislative processes to work, particularly from a science point of view, I should add, then that information can be used by anyone, scientist or the public or anyone else, to put together another nomination, and then the committee would go through a similar process. And it's quite possible they would view it a bit differently the second time round, I suspect. And just to give you an idea of sorts of things that are already listed in Victoria, the impact of noisy miners was listed last year under our Act. Impact of Samba was also listed. In both cases, there already been done quite a bit of work on these species, identifying the impacts that they'd have on our native fauna and our flora. And just a few things that you might like to think about, in addition to the possible future nomination, is that in my discussions with the current convener of the committee, David Morgan, his response he's had a number of times is that in our discussions about this particular issue, is that he says that it's often been humans providing the conditions under which these pest species, if you like, can survive, and in particular he's called the common myna a human commensal, which I think is a good description, which my initial map of the distribution of that species in Victoria, you can clearly see how the detection, if you like, of common mynas is following roads, major urban centres and the like. But at some point, particularly in Victoria, as it's encroached along areas of the Murray, it will possibly have impacts on region parrot and also superb parrot. But as it stands at the moment, that information hasn't been gathered to a point where the common myna particularly is occurring in those areas. And I thought it was an interesting point that's been picked up already. The common mynas tend to be less commonly recorded in the forested areas, which might be an indicator of the slow, movement of these species into that area. So I've just give you that's just a quick summary of how the assessment's worked in Victoria, and I understand there's similar processes in other states, and happy to advise on people if there's any way we can contribute in that regard.
We've actually got time for one question if someone has one before morning tea. Yes.
I'm just wondering whether the definition that it needs to lead to extinction is not too tough and shouldn't be looked at.
Yes, that's a fair comment. Look, I think I think that's partly a reflection of the age of our Act. It's amongst the oldest legislation in Australia, and in many ways it's been a bit left behind compared to particularly New South Wales, which has got a finer, more representative definition, if you like. But one of the things to remember here is it's the assessment of the scientific committee to show that there's a potential, it doesn't have to be proven, but a potential for the impact a species is having to lead to the extinction of something in the future. So, for instance, Samba, which are expanding massively in Victoria, there's potential there already that it's having a big impact on rainforest communities in East Gippsland, for instance. That's been fairly well documented. Now, if nothing else, I think more research, which has already been done, particularly in ACT and New South Wales, I think similar things need to be done in Victoria, which would enable this process to be restarted.